at one point, right? And he would always be like super vocal when he does something nice that a Warlock can do, you know? He's like, oh, I actually put Curse of Weakness here in this mob, and you can see it does a lot less damage. And I'm like, yeah, Shelly, yes,
Yeah,
you're being very useful.
Last I checked, Curse of Weakness doesn't in fact do any damage, so not a damage increase to hit that ability. Now, neither of these teams have that Curse of Weakness in their group. No Warlocks in the MDI ever. Well, actually, back in 2010 they were, but yeah, both teams going for this massive pull here. Sloth actually going for a slightly smaller pull, not pulling in that fourth pack in the back. Now, of course, you have to keep an eye on Echo here. They're going to be taking a lot of damage from those AoE casts going off because they have a bigger pack, and once their AoE CC runs out, they're going to have to single target interrupt. But if I'm correct, and I think I remember properly from their pulls this morning, they are abusing the Wonder Grow cast from the Fungalmancer. Yes, so they will be keeping that alive throughout this first section of the dungeon. Gingy will be spell stealing that as much as possible to keep a damage buff going on him, and as a result of that, his character will get larger and larger and larger, which is kind of funny when he's playing a dwarf.
Oh, I'm actually interested to see that big dwarf on Echo side, while Sloth playing a little bit different. So they did do a pretty big pull at the start, but not as big as Echo. So you can see the trash difference there, 17% trash after dealing with those slimes in the middle. And of course, the Affixes Spiteful and Grievous Tyrannical is something that can be incredibly annoying, as you can see how many Spiteful Shades they're actually spawning. And look how long this pull is taking them, just because of these Spiteful Shades. And you actually see the Shadow Priest going down, unfortunately, for this very last Shade that was chasing him. Just hit him there and he went down. But yeah, just unfortunate, as he also released. That means he's going to be running back, costing them even more time. But yeah, just you see how annoying it can be to deal with these Spiteful Shades, just because it slows you down so much if you don't have any sort of like mass roots or rings that help you out with seeing them.
Little bit of a scary moment as Echo gathered around that pull as well, pulling them on top of Globgrog, the first boss here. Now just barely got away without proccing his cheat death. Jeeth was able to keep him alive. And looks like Fragments has taken a majority of the pie on those small ads. So you can see that DK still does work in massive AoE situations if you let them. But of course, Mage just too powerful and just catching up at the very end, especially with that Wonder Grow buff that he's stacking. Of course, you got to remember that's a damage buff that stacks as many times as you can spell steal it. So as long as he has mana in the mana pool, he should be able to keep infinitely stacking that. And of course, one of the things that helps a lot with that is the Prideful buff, because you have to remember, Prideful gives you a massive amount of mana regen. So free spell steals pretty much the entire time you have that up here.
Yeah, unfortunately, Marky is going down again for Sloth, as they had to use that Battle Rest from the DK to get him back up. Because of that pride that they spawned here. So definitely looks like Sloth is doing everything a little bit slower, not just because of the deaths, but just the route itself just seemed like they're going for a little bit safer pulls. We see a pretty big pull from Echo here, as they're gathering up this whole area, basically, just pulling it into the Plague Borers, probably because of Gingy's buff here. You can see Gingy has PI, and has all of these Wonder Growths from the Fungalmancer that is being CC'd in this corner here. Just huge amounts of damage coming out of the Mage, as they're just gathering up this whole area here, proccing the 40% Pride. Yeah, that was a huge amount of trash that they just nuked down there.
Yep, and of course you have to remember these pulls are a lot less dangerous than what we're used to seeing, because they do have those disease dispels in their group, so their tank doesn't have to worry about having any stat reduction. And yeah, I mean, you can just see the power of that Wonder Grow buff on top of the Mage. Every time he casted a Flame Strike, he was doing like 500,000 damage in Combust. It's absolutely ridiculous what you get when you stack a damage buff, power infusion, Fey Guardians on top of 100% crit you have during combustion. It's kind of ridiculous what you can do. Now, I'm actually interested to see what they plan on doing, because one of the changes that we're seeing from a lot of these teams when they adapt to this Holy Paladin Shadow Priest comp is that you have to figure out a way to do the dungeon without Shadow Meld, right? Paladins can't be Night Elves, there you go. I was about to say Night Fae. I couldn't remember the actual word. Paladins can't be Night Elves, so they don't have access to Shadow Meld. So what we're actually seeing as a result of that is some teams have opted to pretty much completely drop the Night Elves altogether. Of course, Demon Hunters don't have an option to be anything else, so they still have to be Night Elf. But everyone else in the group has gone Dark Iron Dwarf or Dwarf, so you can see they have the racials from those instead. So it's interesting to see that as a kind of a change here. And actually, if I'm not mistaken, there's a lot of things that you can self-dispel with those racials in this dungeon to give you the buff that you get from that.
Yeah, definitely. There's lots of debuffs you can use that racial on. So really nice to see that they're min-maxing their racials now that they're not forced to pick that Shadow Melt, that Night Elf racial. So very interesting to see. And now they're proccing their 60% Pride. Looks like they're just pulling it with the mini-boss. That is actually so efficient because you have those Plague Boars that explode. And the Plague Boars are target capped. So they will hit at maximum 4 other mobs and themselves. So 5 in total, but 1 will always go themselves. So by having the mini-boss and the Pride is actually huge value to be able to get those double explosions. Now almost going down here as these Plague Boars actually do a lot of damage to the tank whenever they're not exploding. So definitely a little bit of an issue, but did manage to recover as they're now moving on. And one thing to note about their comp is that, as we talked about, just the mage being fed all of these buffs, right? We see the priest having being Night Fae with those Fae Guardians to reduce the combustion, and PI as well, of course, being buffed to the mage. Then you have the Paladin that gives versatility whenever he uses that Ashen Hollow that buffs the whole group. Of course, the Demon Hunter is giving the magic damage increase. But what does Fragnance do in the DK? Like, why is he not playing that Warrior to get that banner for the Mastery buff? Like, I feel like Fragnance really is not fitting into this comp right here. I mean... I don't know.
I feel like that final slot is just kind of like a utility / also solid AoE class, right? Like DK fills in all the holes where your mage doesn't have combust to blow up the pack. It does generally good damage all the time. So I think it's a pretty solid option. Not to mention it also brings AMZ and just has generally good self-survivability in general. So it's definitely not just a bad 5th slot option. I think the other option that teams might have gone for, before 9.1.5 would have been the Windwalker Monk for similar reasons. But of course, on this patch, Windwalker is pretty significantly nerfed after they did a lot of hotfix changes to it. So I'm not really sure that would be a good option anymore. So yeah, I think it's just kind of like a general good class.
I was just wondering because, of course, I do think that DK, of course, is probably overall better than a warrior, right? Otherwise, we would see a lot more warriors. But for this dungeon specifically, they don't have any other Necrolords. As you can see, the Covenants, we have Night Fae, Kiri, and Venthyr. So not a single Necrolord. And we did talk about Necrolord just not being that big of a difference here in this dungeon, because you can use the Fleshcraft and get that the haste buff, but it's not that big of a deal for Plaguefall. It's not as good as like the Gargoyle Charm in Halls, for example. So definitely something that we've seen teams skip before. But I was thinking, since the Warrior banner got changed, the Necrolord banner that is also buffing Mastery to 2 other close by members, I was thinking maybe it would be worth it to play in this dungeon, but Echo is not picking it. And Fragrance actually used to play a Warrior in the past, so if Fragrance not playing Warrior, I guess it's just not worth it for that banner, I guess, and for the buff.
So the interesting thing about the banner as well is that like there were a lot of sims done over the past week or so, and surprisingly enough, for overall damage, the banner is really only like a 2 or 3% DPS increase per person the buff goes on. And in addition to that, Mastery is generally not a good AoE stat for Fire Mages, right? The Fire Mage Mastery is just Ignite. And if you don't have a whole bunch of things that really buff Ignite, similar to like the Mastery % stacking we saw at the end of last expansion, it's really not something they lean into right now. Fire Mages more go for like a haste versatility build right now, so they get more flame blasts and more flame strikes off as much as possible. So the Mastery buff really wouldn't be too insane for them. It might actually be good with combustion for general damage. It actually would be pretty solid for single target damage, but for overall damage, it's really not that powerful, I don't think.
Do you know how it is for Shadow Priest as well? Because I would assume they're the ones getting the other buff. Because for Paladins, of course, it's not good for their damage, right? They don't want Mastery. So I'm not sure how it is for Shadow Priest. Maybe it will be good for single target, who knows?
Me bring up the spreadsheet really quick while we're keeping an eye on them as they pull down this 4th manifestation of Pride, and this will be the rest of the trash count they need for the dungeon here as well. After this Pride, they're just going to be killing boss, trash, then boss, right? All of the trash they need to finish off the 100% count is going to be down by that final boss of the dungeon. So yeah, Echo's kind of trucking through this dungeon right now, already pulling Dom in a pre-10 minutes on a pretty ridiculous pace.
Yeah, they're actually incredibly clean. If you look at the deaths, they have 0 deaths. They played so clean and didn't look like they made any other mistakes either. In Spires, we saw some things that maybe were not intended, and they just had to like wait a little bit for the true shot be ready, lose a second here or there. But here in Plaguefall, it really didn't seem like they were losing any time whatsoever. Everything seemed incredibly quick. No breaks in between, everything being gathered immediately. So yeah, just incredibly clean by Echo, as they're just now 10 minutes into the dungeon and they're already on that 3rd boss and 86% trash in. So this is going to be an incredibly quick run by Echo with that new comp that we just started seeing last Cup, so 2 weekends ago. We saw this comp in some dungeons. We saw it in halls of a tournament, and we saw it in the other side. But in most dungeons, people were still playing Disc Priest and Windwalker Monk, right? But now we actually see this switch to the comp in almost all the dungeons so far. And we also see the Shadow Priest, of course, to replace the Disc Priest, to still have the PI and the Fey Guardians to support the mage damage. So interesting to see how Echo is adapting to this comp so quickly, and also having these incredibly fast runs, even though they're switching their comp around. And comp switches, of course, are difficult because all of a sudden you have different kinds of utility, different kinds of damage profiles. You have cooldowns at different points in the dungeon. So you really have to adjust your routes and adjust your strategy to see how you can play differently now, especially because the Holy Paladin has that huge damage cooldown now, that Ashen Hollow from Venthyr, which isn't a really long cooldown though, it's 4 minutes. So you really want to play around that, right? You want to make sure that you're having those crucial pulls whenever that Ashen Hollow is up.
Yeah, exactly. Now I pulled up the spreadsheet, and it looks like Mastery actually is pretty solid in general for Shadow Priest, right? Like it's going to be pretty good, so it might actually be something that could be looked at. But I think one of the major things people were looking at in general was that, like, usually when you bring that warrior, it's a question of whether or not that initial burst on your other classes is going to be worth losing the damage from the other class you're bringing, right? Now, I don't think DK is specifically overpowered. Like, depending on some of the pull sizes you do, like in dungeons where you only do trash pulls that are like 5 or 6 mobs, a Fury Warrior could actually like do a ton of damage, right? They're very good in general right now, especially after the large amount of buffs they've gotten in the past few patches. So it might be something we could see once teams, actually, realize that and try to play around it a little bit. But yeah, I'm interested to see now that you mention it, whether or not it's something that could be brought up, because the initial burst of mastery could enable some bigger pulls when you think about stacking all those other buffs on top of what you already have, right? It really would enable your mage and even your Shadow Priest to do a lot of damage. I feel like Shadow Priest is actually kind of sleeper right now, right? Because we talk about how it's just a general good class in addition to the buffs that it brings. But it has some of the most ridiculous scaling that I think I've seen on any classes. Like if you go look at sims for Shadow Priest right now, some of their secondary stat scalings are like higher than main stat scalings for other classes. It's kind of bonkers what they get. It's really huge. Okay, that's crazy. Yeah. I mean, that's really something that we might see then, especially in the Necrolord dungeons, right? Because Necrolord is really this one covenant that we haven't really seen, or that none of the MDI classes really wants to play, right? Like, none of these classes want to play Necrolord. So if a warrior could actually fill that spot and actually also buff other players with damage, then that might really be something that we could see in maybe Theater of Pain as well, because in Theater of Pain, the Necrolord buff is actually better than in Plaguefall. That banner that the Venthyr, the Necrolord's versatility buff and the movement speed buff, it's actually pretty valuable. And we've seen in the past that the healer would actually go Necrolord to be able to click that banner. But now that they play Paladin healer, they can't really go Necrolord, because then they lose their whole purpose being Ashen Hollow, right? So we'll see how they play that. Maybe theoretically they could also play Prot Warrior Necrolord and bring a Havoc Demon Hunter, but Havoc is like their weakness is like single target, right? They have like pretty decent AoE, but the single target is probably a problem, especially when you play TOP, right? Mm-hmm. Which requires quite a bit of single target damage. Yep, for sure. The two holy paladins in the entire world that are actually Necrolord are crying right now. Thanks for that, Negra. Echo now in
I'm
the
sorry.
final phase of Margrave's Stradama, going for a sub 15 time here in Plaguefall, which is blazing fast speed. 2 very quick dungeons with 0 deaths for Echo as they're going to be taking down Sloth 2-0 to start off our first day of the final cup here in this first season of 2021 MDI.
And wow, looking at the overall damage meters here,
17.
Gingy Dwarf, 17,000 effective DPS.
Man.
We are rapidly getting back to BFA numbers here, and it is the first patch of the expansion. My goodness.
Oh my